everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you listen to. So I'm Sarah. I'm the host, or also the coordinator of the webinars for the IWM group. And Brian McIntosh from the International Water Centre in Brisbane will be our speaker today. And he introduced us all into the integrated water management, what it is and how does also relate to the SDGs. And I'm really excited about it. And I think that's all from my side. And I'm happy to give the word now to Brian to introduce us all to the topic.
Sure, thanks. Thank you very much, Sarah. Look, I will just very briefly start my video just so you can see me. I always think it's nice to be able to see who's presenting. I'll switch off the video in case it causes problems for bandwidth. As you can see, it's morning time here in Brisbane. The sun is coming up, and it's a bit bright in one side of the room. So whether it's morning time where you are, or whether it's afternoon or evening, I'd like to say welcome everyone to the webinar. In this webinar, we're going to be exploring integrated water management, the why and the what it is and why it's a suitable approach for delivering the SDGs and sustainable development more broadly. My name's Brian McIntosh. I'm the Education Director here at the International Water Centre, or IWC as we call ourselves. There will be an opportunity for some questions at the end, and on the last slide that I'll show, I'll also have some contact details should you wish to follow up by email or Skype or even by phone. Just a little bit of background. Let me get the slide forward. Oh, there we go. I'll just briefly say something about the IWC. So we're a capacity building organisation based in Brisbane, which is located about the middle of the east coast of Australia in the state of Queensland. Queensland is famous for a lot of things. We've just had a major drought and a major flood, but we're at the place where the Great Barrier Reef exists, just off the coast for sort of 1,500 kilometres, 2,000 kilometres of the coast of Queensland, which is a big long state. One of the main activities of the IWC is delivering a professionally oriented Master of Integrated Water Management. And that's a programme that seeks to build the kinds of practical knowledge, skills and capabilities in individuals that we view as being necessary to respond to global water and sustainable development challenges. We've had the programme running. We've now got the 11th cohort. We've had it running for 11 years with the explicit purpose of building a community of engaged, effective change agents, really, working across the world to transform the way that we think about and act to manage water. And we've got this community now spread across 86 different countries. That's just a little bit of context about us. We do training and online training projects and a bunch of other things, but all focused really on capacity building and building capacity for the implementation of integrated water management. For this webinar, if I can advance the slide, here we go. I suppose what we want overall for you from this webinar is to have been exposed to our interpretation, and I use the word interpretation quite deliberately, our interpretation of integrated water management, what it is, why it's significant as an approach for delivering the SDGs. The bullet points on the slide in front of you show the main areas that we're going to cover in more detail today. So we're going to be looking, I suppose, at the relationships between water and sustainable development. We'll be looking at the complex and contested meaning of sustainable development and why that's okay. We'll be covering what IWM is and is not from different perspectives, creating the case for why we need to use IWM approaches, detailing, I suppose, how IWM provides a response to complexity through learning, and remembering that complexity is a fundamental, I suppose, characteristic of sustainable development. And how we'll also be covering how IWM approaches can be fostered through simple daily practices at team, project and programme levels, as well as through the development of particular kinds of skills and knowledge profiles in professionals and in organisations. To get started, what I'd like to do is turn our attention to this, I suppose, to sustainable development and water. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, UNESCO. There's a link on the screen in front of you. They provide what I think is a great way of seeing the relationships between water and sustainable development by categorizing the SDGs. The SDGs are perhaps currently the most famous operational definition of sustainable development. Certainly, I think what we find is it's known in professional circles, maybe not so well known in the general public. But the SDGs are not the only definition of sustainable development, and it's worth making sure that's maybe not at the front of your mind, but somewhere fairly close to the front of your mind. UNESCO's diagram that's on the screen in front of us, it shows how water is really unsurprisingly central to the achievement of sustainable development. So there's a dedicated SDG, SDG 6, that I'm sure you're all probably familiar with. But UNESCO's diagram also shows how water is explicitly a part of achieving a further 7 SDGs. And that it's directly or implicitly a part it's implicitly a part of achieving a further 9 SDGs, and it means really that water is directly, explicitly, or implicitly a part of achieving all 17 SDGs. This really, I think, quite often, I think this speaks to why people get involved in water and water management. You know, water is central to achieving sustainable development. Almost everything, either directly or indirectly, depends on water. It's therefore it's a meeting ground. It's a meeting ground for people who are interested in tackling some of the most complex and interconnected challenges that face our countries and globally the world. If we take the SDGs as a definition of sustainable development, and that's not a crazy thing to do, but bear in mind they're not the only definition of sustainable development. You might say, great, so we know what sustainable development is, and we know what role water plays in delivering it. And I suppose, well, sort of. Sustainable development is ultimately the aim of integrated water management. It's easy to forget that integrated water management is a means. It's not an end in itself. When people find they have a great approach or a great tool, they tend to go around looking for ways to apply that approach and tool and sort of forget that the approach or tool isn't really the end objective. It's whatever the approach or tool enables you to do. So IWM is an approach or a tool, a means to achieve sustainable development. But what sustainable development is and means is contested, regardless of how widely accepted the SDGs might seem to be. Take what you see in front of you. This was the outputs of a very brief exercise with a small set of our master's program participants. I'd asked them to form pairs and then to write down the most important 3 meanings of sustainable development. The first most important meanings they identified in their pairs are shown on the screen, and no 2 of them are the same. All of them use terms which themselves require further definition and which are open to further debate and differences of view, such as equitable development, balance, environment, benefits. And all of this is okay. Sustainable development is an example of what sociologists sometimes call a boundary object. That is, it's a concept which offers sufficient precision and meaning for different people to engage in discussion about it, and through that discussion to generate further meanings and hopefully agreements on action. But if sustainable development is a contested concept, then what does that mean for the application of an approach or a tool? What does it mean for IWM, given that IWM can be seen, or should probably be seen as a tool or an approach to implement sustainable development? To answer that question, what I'll do is I'll start by outlining a framework for IWM, which positions IWM as a set of principles or practices or ways of thinking and doing, and a set of management objectives for the purpose of achieving or implementing sustainable development, or at least the water-related parts of sustainable development. But as we've seen on a couple of slides ago, there's not much of sustainable development that is not in some way related to or dependent upon water. Thinking about IWM in this way enables us to then think about IWM as a general approach, which can then be applied to different areas of water management, areas that correspond to the practical work that's undertaken every day across the world's water sectors. For example, IWM applied to water resource management is IWRM, integrated water resource management. Applied to urban water management is IUWM, integrated urban water management. And it's important not to get too hung up on the on labels. But a question that we often get is, why is it IWM? Why is it not IWRM? And for us, it's the same thing. It's a set of principles, but which have been applied to a specific application area, water resource management. Okay, so if IWM is a set of general principles and practices, what are these general principles and practices? We can find, I suppose, lots of different articulations of these general principles and practices in different places according to application area. For example, if we look at the definitions of IWRM, like the ones provided by the Global Water Partnership, or GWP, we'll find principles like the ones in front of you. So coordinated development of water, land, and related resources. This implies that IWM or IWRM is concerned with somehow coordinating policy planning and management across sectors and resources. Maximize economic and social welfare without compromising vital ecosystems. This implies that IWM or IWRM is concerned with ensuring that water is managed in a way that respects the triple bottom line of sustainable development. But in an equitable manner, this implies that IWM or IWRM has a focus on fairness and justice in some way, which I guess are some of the foundations of social sustainability. One way to think about principles such as the ones that you see encapsulated in that GWP statement in front of you is that they are compasses that point towards sustainable development. Another way to think about them is that they encourage us to focus holistically at the whole system level rather than in terms of parts treated separately. We can also find examples of general IWM objectives, such as the 3 E's of economic efficiency, social equity, and environmental sustainability, that we must somehow try to balance in some way together. The act of balancing these objectives together is what makes water management that attempts to do so integrated in some way. And that's one view of what makes the integrated in IWM or IWRM. And again, this articulation of objectives, it sort of points us both towards sustainability, but they also offer, a bit like the previous GWP definition, they offer us a framework and they push us towards thinking and acting systemically to achieve multiple objectives. They push us away from thinking of the world and managing the world in separate boxes and push us towards managing water resources or whatever aspect of water we're managing in a much more systemic way. So that's fine and fair enough. We've got these sort of systemic, holistic, sustainability-oriented principles and even management objectives. It's good to ask, well, why should we utilize these kinds of principles and objectives to guide our work in water management? Why should we do that at project or program scale? Why should we follow these principles or objectives in policy formulation or in strategic planning when we're designing and figuring out what infrastructure and investments to make? Why not just do normal, in inverted commas, water management? The slide you've got in front of you shows one of the reasons why not. Normal water management involves water management problems such as providing improved sanitation to an urban population, in this case Dhaka and Bangladesh, being split up into parts. And you'll see that top line. So the parts are containment, emptying, transport, treatment, reuse, and disposal. In this case, it's the parts of the sanitation chain. This diagram is an example of a World Bank SFD. SFD stands for ship flow diagram, and it's a way of mapping out what happens to solid, liquid and then solid human waste. What this SFD for Dhaka shows is that if we focus on one element and on improving it, for example, on improving containment, we can end up concluding incorrectly that we've succeeded. So in Dhaka, this might mean seeing 99% containment of, or 98% containment of, it's 99% containment of sewage as having been achieved. But if we stop to look, I suppose if we stop looking at the parts in isolation and start to look at the whole system, in this case, the whole chain, and how sewage and solid biosolids flow through it, then we can see that ultimately actually only 2%, that's the green line that ends up on the right-hand side, of sewage in Dhaka is safely disposed of. 98% of sewage is not. And that means it's a qualitatively very different conclusion from only examining the containment side of things. So we've got to, I suppose what this diagram and the methodology that the World Bank is putting forward here is that we've got to think and act to improve, I suppose, whole systems and not just the parts of systems. And unless we understand what the system is, it's very difficult to know whether we're improving the whole system or whether we're just improving some part, but actually possibly causing more problems elsewhere. Another example of why we don't just do normal water management is the Pakmun Dam in front of you. This dam was one of the first dams built on a major tributary of the Mekong in the mid-1990s, and the tributary is the Moon River in Thailand. It joins the Mekong at a town called Kong Chiem. The dam was built to provide about 120 to 130 megawatts of power generation capacity. And the engineers who designed the dam, however, they didn't factor in the fisheries of the Moon River, fisheries which have provided the main source of protein and livelihood for thousands of people in Isan province, which is the province in that the Mekong flows through in northeast Thailand. And they also didn't factor in that the fish and in those fisheries require migration to reproduce. So when the dam was built, fish were not able to migrate properly, and around about 160 or so species from the 270 fish species in the river were effectively knocked out in terms of viable populations. This had the knock-on effect of disrupting the livelihoods and culture of the villages on the Moon River, which had been in place for at least 3,000 years, the particular kind of subsistence and livelihood culture. And a disruption which, in combination with other economic forces, including globalization, it's still playing out in terms of changing village life near the Moon River in quite fundamental and profound ways, ways which raise all sorts of questions about sustainability. Questions about sustainability such as, where do people get their protein from now that they're not getting them from the river? Stuart Orr from WWF released a paper a couple of years ago looking at the impacts and implications of protein replacement. So if you're not getting fish from your protein from fish from the river, which in a sense is free protein, you don't need to farm it deliberately. Well, where else might that protein come from? And at the scale of the whole Mekong, the consequences are significant in terms of land clearing, which has both a waterway health impact, a biodiversity impact, also as a carbon impact. And then you've got to start intensively farming. And intensive farming requires energy inputs, which are carbon emissions, and nitrogen and phosphorus applied as fertilizers, which then have further ecosystem degradation effects. So the regional and down even at the local level, sustainable development impacts of treating energy generation separate from everything else have not been good and have been quite profound and are still playing out. Normal approaches to water management don't emphasize looking out beyond the silos that are made from the ways in which we organize and structure and deliver water management. We've got to form organizations. Organizations have got to do things, but the scope and the responsibilities of those organizations create silos, which don't necessarily then coordinate with each other. Looking out from those silos to inform policy planning and management from a whole of system, triple bottom line, full cost benefit perspective is needed really to ensure that we don't solve problems like not having enough electricity at the expense of creating new problems, such as the degradation of fisheries and livelihoods and the need to then put in place very energetically and environmentally damaging alternatives to protein production. And we can think of such practices as problem shifting and potentially resulting in, I suppose we can think of such practices as problem shifting. So normal water management runs the risk of shifting problems, of creating net costs rather than benefits. You solve a problem in one place and you create a set of problems elsewhere or downstream. And change the distribution of costs and benefits and risks across stakeholders, and not necessarily in good ways. And one of the problems of, I suppose, normal water management in complex situations is that quite often you don't know what you don't know. I suppose IWM starts from a position of accepting that it's not possible for any one person or organization to fully appreciate a situation. And a situation might be a village, it might be a whole catchment, might be part of a river. If it's the whole of a catchment, it might be small, it might be large, like the Mekong. It might be a city, and a situation might even be an organization. The kinds of situations that probably motivate all of you, and the kinds of situations that motivate me are complex. This is a great diagram from the Open University in the UK, and it sort of shows a complex system as being a bit like a really large bowl of spaghetti or noodles that's moving around as it's being eaten. It's too big and it's moving, and as a consequence, it isn't possible to see or know everything that's happening. So that's what you see when you've got those little heads. They represent us, people, individuals looking in, sometimes actually from within a situation, sometimes from outside, and thinking that we might see everything, but of course we don't, and we're quite often unaware of the bounds of what we do know and what we don't know. It isn't possible to see or know everything that's happening, and our individual and cognitive and value-based perspectives limit what we see, and sometimes force us to unconsciously to filter out things. You know, we just don't see that it's important, so we don't pay any attention. IWM, for us at the IWC, starts from the position that we cannot work in silos, that we cannot necessarily comprehend the kinds of fully comprehend the kinds of situations in which we work. And we must, as a consequence, reach out to others to ensure that we're able to bring sufficient diversity of perspectives to the water management or sustainable development situation at hand. This view frames IWM, I suppose, really as being a rational response to the inherent limitations of complexity. Complexity which exists because we work in situations that are comprised of often hidden social, ecological, hydrological and economic processes, and situations where there may be different diagnoses of what's wrong and therefore what should be done. Such situations are, I suppose, they're certainly complex, and they're quite often called wicked, or those situations present wicked problems. The Pakmun Dam engineers, to briefly return to the Pakmun Dam, they wouldn't have deliberately intended to degrade fisheries and livelihoods. You know, I've got great faith in people not intending to act badly, but more likely they simply did not know that the dam would have those impacts. They were caught in a silo. They were caught in a sense in a cognitive trap created by the roles and responsibilities and the bounding of their organisation, plus their own disciplinary cognitive biases. They were caught in a silo, planning how to generate electricity without even knowing that they didn't know anything about the wider context. An IWM, multiple perspective approach, could have avoided this. So, seeking and engaging with alternative and multiple perspectives is perhaps then key to the practice of IWM. It offers a way to uncover the aspects of a situation that you don't know, and to incorporate their consideration into whatever it is that you're doing, policy, planning, management. This is, I think, a rational and a pretty practical response to complexity. You know, you don't just say, oh, wow, it's complex, throw up my hands, don't know what to do. Actually, you can do something. You can collaborate, you can participate. It's also a way of ensuring that the implementation of sustainable development provides a mechanism for dialogue and deliberation across stakeholders. And remember that sustainable development, despite the clear framing of the SDGs, is contested. Not everyone's necessarily going to agree with what the SDGs have put forward as being the key priorities and the ways of measuring the achievement of those priorities. And the fact that it's contested that's fine. You know, this is about complex situations, which are partly complex because people have different views as to what's going on and what should be done. Engaging multiple perspectives as we collectively decide on the direction and navigate somehow towards sustainable development can be done through participation. This can involve including ordinary citizens or communities in decision-making and planning processes. Participation can be thought of as having a range of levels from less to more. from manipulation at the bottom, which is not so good, to citizen control at the top, which might be viewed as good, but has a set of practical problems in terms of cost and time, as shown here in this is Sherry Arnstein's famous ladder of participation, came from her paper, which is referenced on the left-hand side. Participation, as well as helping to uncover the things you don't know, also provides a set of benefits such as democratization, fairness, capacity building, and potentially also increased levels of acceptance and effectiveness for management actions. Multiple perspectives can also be brought to bear by collaboration across organizations. The diagram in front of you comes from work that we did here at the IWC about how to transform urban water management to achieve a set of sustainability dimensions and ambitions which were wrapped up in this thing called the water sensitive city. The work that we did emphasized the need to build capacity both within and across organizations responsible for different aspects of the urban water cycle, from water supply and sanitation through flood risk management to public green space planning and maintenance. Building capacity across organizations is about, for us at least, about building capacity to collaborate, to understand the remits and objectives of other organizations and maybe even other departments and teams within your organization, to generate trust. Trust is what makes collaboration possible, and to become able to see how to work together in new and perhaps unexpected ways that have got benefits, win-wins to both parties. Being concerned with incorporating multiple perspectives in order to take a whole of systems approach to improving situations, that's certainly what we view IWM as being, is therefore really at its core it's about learning. It's about learning, but not so much about how to get better and more efficient at delivering water management outcomes in traditional ways. What we might, and what you'll see on the diagram there, being as called single loop learning, which is, are we doing things right? You know, are we reducing the costs? Are we getting better at delivering X or Y? Rather, IWM is about a different kind of learning. It's about catalyzing learning across perspectives, which then creates opportunities for double loop learning. Are we doing the right things? You know, you might be doing the wrong thing very well. You need to have processes and opportunities and ways and mechanisms within the organization that you work in across organizations to pose this question, well, actually, are we doing the right things? Maybe even to pose the question, well, how on earth do we decide what's the right thing to do here? Realizing that current practices may not be adequate starts such a process of learning, which then creates the way in which new ways of doing things might be developed, new ways that might address new drivers or avoid unwanted side effects and problem shifting. So when you see process diagrams and frameworks that show what IWM or IWRM or IUWM is, I would perhaps suggest that you might think about them as being more than a fixed set of steps in a process that implements IWM. Perhaps I'd suggest that you might think about them as a set of steps that create opportunities for learning about the direction that should be followed to implement sustainable development, and a set of steps that provide opportunities for then figuring out how to actually move in that direction. How might we manifest IWM as a practice? Well, you know, there are opportunities every day. Whether you're in a project planning or management meeting, whether you're having a conversation a bit more informally with members of your team, whether you're in longer scale program planning, and these opportunities need to be created by people like yourself. They are opportunities to, I suppose, to start conversations about whether the right things are being done or not. And those kinds of opportunities can be created by asking pretty simple questions like the ones on the slide. Of course, you're not going to ask them perhaps in exactly the same form as they are on the slide, and you're not going to ask them all the time or all four of them all at once. People will start to think you're a little bit crazy in your team conversations. But, you know, using these questions, plain, simple English questions, where are we going with this? Is it desirable? You know, who's going to gain and who's going to lose, and what should be done? Pretty easy questions which create the opportunity for the people that you're talking with to reflect and to engage in learning, which might then open up that double or triple loop learning process. At IWC, we think that to engage in such conversations across multiple and diverse disciplinary, functional, and community perspectives requires a particular set of skills. Skills in being able to understand and translate what you hear into your own discipline or function, so that you're able to identify ways of bringing together multiple objectives from multiple stakeholders and views. We think of these skills as being a kind of a profile, a T-shaped profile. So if you look at the screen, there's a T in front of you. If we think about the vertical part of it, it's the I. So we have deep, the vertical dimension, knowledge about a restricted scope. That's why the I, the vertical bar, is narrow. And we think that a T-shaped profile is composed of deep specialist knowledge. So an engineer knowing a lot about civil engineering, for example, complemented by a crossbar, this sort of T-shape, which means then that engineer, for example, is able to talk coherently with an ecologist or with an economist or with a lawyer or a community development practitioner, and that they're able to figure out how to incorporate that other person's objectives into their own. Water sensitive urban design and water sensitive cities is, I suppose, an example of sustainable development in urban form planning and water management. To some extent, has come about as a consequence of engineers learning how to talk with others, learning actually from an ecological perspective. Draining water out of a city really quickly is not a good thing. It causes erosion and degradation of stream channel form and ecological habitat. Actually be much better to slow the water down. So engineers can then think about how to manage flood in a way that doesn't cause ecological degradation. And that only happens if you have engineers willing and capable to talk with ecologists, and ecologists willing and capable to talk with engineers. We see that this sort of need to act collaboratively, collectively at whole of system scale is pressing. We see that at IWC that we need to collectively develop the capacity in individuals, organizations, sectors, and across sectors to engage with each other and to start the conversations that will ultimately lead to changes in the way that we think about and manage water. We need to do this because we have really fairly significant challenges in the 21st century. We have a set of drivers which mean that our countries and the world overall is really under pressure like never before. There's now more than 7 billion people on the planet. That's almost a tripling since 1950, in a space of only 68, 69 years. That's huge, almost a tripling of the human population in 68 or 70 years. When you think of the age of the planet, it's a tiny nanosecond in the most recent history of the planet, and we've tripled the population. And of course, tripling the population means that we have significantly increased demand for water, for sanitation, for food, and for energy. We also now have most of the world's population living in cities, and this creates problems, but it also creates opportunities. Problems in that urbanization and the disruption of catchments and their natural hydrological and ecological processes is severe and widespread and growing, but also solutions, and perhaps that we can, like the water sensitive city ambition, perhaps more cost effectively service urban populations with water and wastewater. Perhaps we can create resource recycling loops. Perhaps we can manage floods and stormwater flows in ways that don't cause, in fact, to some degree, actually restore natural catchment hydrological and ecological function to cities. So we've got everyone more people living more closely together. That creates the opportunity for cost-effective investment, but only if we understand what to do through collaboration. Suppose we see that the need for collaborative systemic action is also pressing because we're already beginning to face water security constraints. So this is about 6 years old, this paper now, but the diagram in front of you shows the results of some analysis which were conducted a few years ago by Brian Richter and colleagues. They took a definition of a city as being 100,000 people or more, and they demonstrated that more than 50% of the world's cities, defined as 100,000 people or more, are in river basins where net withdrawals of water are more than net inputs. If you add on the impacts of climate change to those basins, which they didn't do in their analysis, the outcomes will become more complex and likely more problematic. These cities, they're not going to run out of water tomorrow, but they have no long-term water security. So you might think of Cape Town in South Africa, but in multiple locations, potentially combined with significant extreme flooding and the oscillation between flooding and drought happening in much more rapid and unexpected ways. I'm thinking a little bit locally here. We've just had significant extreme flooding, which has happened about 1,000 odd kilometres north of Brisbane, where we are in Queensland, in a town called Townsville, or a city called Townsville. The surrounding region went from a really severe multi-year drought to having a year of rain, a year's worth of rain fall in a week. So we need to think about water security and in quite radically different ways. We need to get out of our silos and start to act collectively if we're going to adapt and achieve whatever we think of as sustainable development, whether it's the SDGs or another interpretation. So look, we've come in this talk a sort of fair way from the SDGs. What I've hoped to have done is to have outlined a view of IWM as being a general set of principles and practices which respond to complexity by employing participation and collaboration, and employing them really for the purpose of learning from other perspectives about how to take better action towards this continually evolving aim and definition of sustainable development. So IWM for us at the IWC, in a sense, is nothing more than a set of skills employed by people and processes in organizations and teams across organizations. Skills that can be developed really in anyone, and which can be manifest in situations from strategic plan formulation to normal project delivery and design to everyday team conversations at your work. And we need, I suppose, to be able to identify what we don't know. We need to be able to work at the situation or systems level if we're going to stand any hope of achieving the SDGs. In the face of population growth, urbanization, climate change, and water insecurity. So look, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and I guess some insight into our take on integrated water management and consequently also integrated water resource management. I'll leave the presentation here, but perhaps with a last word that IWM skills and approaches are, from our perspective, really needed now more than ever. Because of these multiple pressures. And I'm happy to take questions just now, and also happy for people to contact me anytime, really. Visit our website, which is going to be relaunched. The navigability isn't that great just now. We are going to redo our website, which will be up and running in about by the end of April or so. Visit our website. You can contact our general inquiries email, admin@watercentre.org, or you can contact me directly at b.mcintosh@watercentre.org. And I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian, so much for this great and really interesting presentation. So anyone who has a question can either ask in the chat or just raise a hand, as you call it here in the chat, and you can ask Brian directly if you want. And I for sure have enough questions, but if any one of you who joined us for this presentation wants to go first. No one right now?
Edward Bornilla has said, thank you. Thank you. I think it's Edward. Thank you.
Cool. Then I would just start. Maybe someone has to be the first to make some more. So I work mostly in climate change, if you say a big word. I'm just one scientist in a big problem, and an even bigger problem. But do you think we are able to solve problems in like reducing things we already do, or do you think the way is actually to go stop what we're doing and trying to how can I say it, to not make it worse. So I think climate change, we can't go back, but we can make it slower or stop some things to not make it worse. What do you think with water scarcity and stuff like that? What is the way to go?
Yeah, so I suppose you've got to climate change is an interesting one because it really is it's a global commons which requires some action really from everybody and from every country. Water scarcity is it's at least got a couple of different scales of action there. So from a systems perspective, what you tend to talk about is improving situations. So how might we improve the water security of a city or a region? And that's therefore it's at a smaller scale than climate change, which really truly is a sort of global commons issue. When you get to water security, really, I suppose you're talking about hydrological basins. Of course, it's connected to climate change because climate change is driving changes in the distribution and intensity of rainfall, which to some degree is causing the water insecurity problems. So we need to make sure that we're thinking and acting locally within the river basin, but also appreciating that some of the influences on the river basin are global. We also need, I suppose, to think and act even locally sometimes might require, I suppose, thinking and action at a distance. So you might think of water security as being partly about the direct flows and quantities of water in a river basin. Is there enough to satisfy whatever the local demands are? There might be a mix of agriculture and urban and maybe in industry. But you've also, I suppose, we've got to be thinking about well, where else does the water come from? Tony Allen at King's College in London, a chap who created the virtual water concept, he always talks of big water and little water, and big water is basically agriculture and little water is everything else from a human perspective. We know that in our agricultural produce, we've got huge embedded water footprints. So when we're talking about water security, I suppose we've got to be partly trying to ensure that we are collectively at a local scale aware of where the problems might lie. And the problems might lie in terms of an excessive dependence on imported foodstuffs, and therefore an excessive dependence on imported virtual water. If water becomes scarce wherever your food comes from, then that food supply is either at risk of going up in price or of reducing in quantity. So I think we've got to work collectively to get. I suppose part of it's about awareness. It's the first step in any process of change is about awareness, and then of course you've got to start then I suppose outlining a vision of collaboratively developing and outlining a vision of, well, okay, so what do we do? Where do we go? And then there's a process of aligning resources and motivation and commitment to head in the direction of that vision. And that's where you start to need to bring potentially in political will, and that's partly about the public, but it might be about politicians, or it might be about bringing on board senior managers from whatever organisations are working locally with respect to water security.
Yeah.
So look, that's a long answer.
No, that's fine. I mean, it was a difficult question. There's not just one resolution on anything what we do. And I would like to build on it, but we have two questions in the chat. So one from Edward is, does IWM cover water quality modeling?
Yes, sure, absolutely. So if water quality is an issue, then integrated approaches to water management definitely include both monitoring and modelling of water quality. And maybe an example I might provide there would be the system, the sort of monitoring, modelling, management system, which has been created by the Queensland government here to attempt to improve the quality of water that ends up from catchments into the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. The Barrier Reef Lagoon is basically the bit of water between the coast and where the Barrier Reef sort of properly starts. There's a whole range of catchments, some fairly major rivers, some smaller rivers. Some of those catchments are natural, you know, they've not been cleared for agriculture, but there's a reasonable amount of land there which has been cleared for agriculture. And so what the Queensland government has done is has set up I'll call it a system whereby there is water quality monitoring, which is feeding into a fairly highly developed set of models for each of the catchments, which are then translated into action by a set of NRM, natural resource management bodies. So Queensland government does the monitoring and it does the modelling, and then it's translated into management action. You know, farmers practicing differently in terms of fertilizer application or cropping patterns. It's translated into action, and the constraints on action are fed back into the Queensland government by these things called NRM groups, natural resource management groups, which work directly then with farmers and with agricultural stakeholders. The water quality modelling is got to such a point where well, the combination of the monitoring and the modelling has gotten to such a point where it's possible to not just identify a subcatchment, but pretty much down to the level of an individual field. So 50% of the nitrogen load in this catchment is coming from these 3 fields. If that's the case, then the best place to make an impact on reducing nitrogen runoff is in those 3 fields, and so work directly with the farmer or farmers that use those 3 fields for production. So yes, so look, I think where you've got complex, large, potentially large-scale processes like water quality change and the relationships between land and runoff and river health, then modelling is an essential tool. You've got to make sure though that it's I suppose there's 2 ends. One, there's the input end or input side. If you don't have good monitoring, good data to go into models, there's the phrase GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You're going to have nonsense coming out. But you've also got to make sure that you've got good trust. You know, it's no good having a bunch of modelers sat in a room creating forecasts, and then farmers go, don't trust the science, don't trust them. So, you know, actually to make modelling more accepted, there's got to be engagement, whether it's participatory modelling or whether it's something a bit less than that. I guess depends on the context. So look, yes, I would say IWM can include water quality modelling if that's relevant to the situation.
Great, thank you for the question and for the answer. I think I know for personally, modelling without measuring doesn't work. Models are only as good as the data you produce. But the next question from Camilla. So what do you think is the biggest challenge for use IWM in projects? What do we challenge when we speak about? Yeah,
so it's probably it's probably at the design and scoping stage. You know, once a water management project has been scoped and designed and planned and budgeted and money's been granted, it's kind of difficult to shift it. It's sort of locked into some degree. So I think perhaps the biggest challenge is in taking an IWRM approach to the formulation, to the design, to the scoping of projects, so that there's time at the beginning to figure out what you don't know, and incorporate that then into the project design. There are some challenges that we've got, I think, collectively in terms of the way that we structure and deliver work, the projectification of work. If you look at how I suppose even just that reef catchment work that I was talking about. Sure, we've got some government custodians and owners of the models, but the point of engagement with farmers and stakeholders on the ground for both understanding their concerns and influencing them to change their practice, you know, that's funded in projects and programs, which means the NRM groups are they find it really difficult to maintain their knowledge over time because their funding isn't long term or guaranteed. So we end up with institutionalization of knowledge problems because we chop the world up into projects. We also problem owners in a sense. Perhaps governments commission consulting firms to do bits of work for them. The consulting firms do them as projects and then move on. And so again, it's about institutionalization of knowledge and building up over time a proper understanding of the whole situation. If the way that we organize work means that sometimes it's not clear really where the knowledge is being built up at an organizational or institutional scale. The knowledge exists at project scale, but which is all sorts of bits. So I think that's two big challenges to IWRM. One is at the individual project level, and the second is at the sort of I guess a larger sort of how do we build up institutionalized systems knowledge, and that's partly a problem of projectification, you know, chopping up work into projects, but it's partly also a problem of governance and roles and responsibilities. It's difficult inside an organization to do something that's not strictly within the remit of that organization. Water utilities, for example, find this difficult to do. Most water utilities are mandated by law to provide water and to dispose of and treat wastewater. They're not really mandated by the law to produce biosolid compost products or to produce energy, and so it's difficult for people working in those organizations to really take a whole of systems approach and recover materials or generate energy, because it's just not inside the mandate of the organization. And if your senior management are of the view that the organization should do what it's set up to do, then doing something that it's not set up explicitly to do, but which it's not prevented, but that's a hard thing to get moving.
Okay, great, thank you. So if no one else has a question, I maybe have just a last quick question to finish.
Sure.
Maybe this, and it's probably one of the hardest, but maybe the shortest answer you get out of it. What do you think professionally is the hardest to communicate with? Is it the public, other communities, or actually industry politicians?
That's a good question. I have a suspicion that the way that politicians and media interact, there's a sort of a dysfunctional relationship, I think, which has emerged over the last decade to 20 years perhaps, between media and politicians. You know, there's 24-hour news media, which makes politicians, I think that's partly what makes politicians behave as they do and speak in the sort of funny no-speak that they use. So cutting through to politicians and working with politicians when they're in this quite kind of dysfunctional, they need to show results and announceables all the time because of the 24-hour news sort of cycle. That's a significant challenge. But in a sense, it's the same. It's the same challenge as you get with communicating with any stakeholder. It's all about trust. People will listen to you if they trust you. So whether you're talking with communities or whether you're talking with politicians or senior managers, you've got to spend some time to generate trust. And so that people I guess, view whatever you're saying positively rather than negatively. And trust takes time to develop. It's not something that can develop instantly, and it is something that can be destroyed very quickly though. So, you know, enabling, what I suppose with the answer, perhaps politicians are difficult to talk to, but to some degree, the problem is it's just all about trust. You've got to make sure that you invest time in generating that trust.
Okay, never thought about this, about the trust, but yeah, you're probably right about that.
It's
I will think about it.
the oil of social interaction. Nothing happens without trust.
I know. It's just, I think we're just producing so much data to produce knowledge that we don't put too much effort in it to build the trust. That's probably. But yeah, it was really, really interesting talk. Thank you so much, Brian, for giving this webinar and this presentation. And
no, it was a pleasure. I hope it delivered something of use to everyone. IWRM is such a huge topic. You could have all come with extremely diverse expectations of what was going to happen. So hopefully it delivered something of value to everyone.
For me, for sure, because I'm pretty new in this topic. And thank you for everyone who participated today and for asking questions. And I hope we can stay in contact and build something together with the Water Youth Network. Really happy to have you as a cooperation partner, and hope to stay in touch, and let's see what the future brings both of us and our both organizations.
Excellent. And it was a pleasure. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Water Youth Network, and people who are here or are listening.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay. See you later.
See ya.